Winter, 1609. Jamestown Fort, Virginia Colony. The wind off the James River is not just cold. It is a wet, agonizing cold that seeps into the bone. It howls through the cracks in the flimsy wattle and daub huts. Inside, a man, gaunt, his skin the color of parchment, stares at his own leather shoes. He has already eaten his belt. Now he is seriously calculating how much nourishment might be left in the boiled leather of his footwear. Outside the high wooden palisade, the forest is silent. The Powhatan have sealed them in. This is not an adventure. It is a slow, agonizing death. The hunger in that fort was not just starvation. It was the brutal, agonizing price of founding a nation. The 17th century colonists who crossed the Atlantic were not prepared. They came seeking gold or God, but found only a wilderness that was utterly indifferent to their survival. In Virginia they faced a horror of their own making, and in New England a different kind of fear, a fear of the devil and of each other, was brewing, ready to explode. By the end of this journey, you will understand the impossible, foundational reality of survival, faith, and violence that forged the American character. Section 1. The Starving Time. It began in 1607, not with a prayer, but with a business plan. The three ships, the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery, carried 104 men and boys to the shores of Virginia. They were not settlers, in our sense. They were employees of the Virginia Company of London. Their mission was simple: find gold, find a passage to Asia, and don't get killed by the Spanish. Their choice of location was a disaster. They settled on a low, marshy, mosquito-infested peninsula. It was, as one of them wrote, a very fit place for the erecting of a great city. But in truth, it was a death trap. Why? Because it was militarily defensible. They were more afraid of a Spanish fleet sailing up the river than they were of the stagnant, brackish water they were forced to drink. The first mistake was the location. The second was the personnel. They were, by and large, gentlemen adventurers, men who had never soiled their hands with manual labor. They were accompanied by jewelers, a perfumer, and goldsmiths. What they lacked were farmers, carpenters, and blacksmiths. They spent their days digging for fool's gold, while their food stores rotted. Captain John Smith, a brash, pragmatic, and thoroughly abrasive mercenary, saw the rot immediately. He took control through sheer force of will, imposing martial law. His famous edict, "He that will not work shall not eat." Smith forced the gentlemen to build shelters and plant crops, and he bullied, threatened, and traded with the local Powhatan tribes for corn. It was just enough. Then, in October 1609, a stray spark from a matchlock musket ignited Smith's gunpowder bag. Horrifically burned, he was forced to sail back to England. The moment he left, the colony collapsed. The Powhatan, no longer held in check by Smith's diplomacy or his threats, established a siege. They blockaded the fort, killing anyone who ventured out. The 500 colonists inside began to die. This was the starving time. As the winter set in, they ate their livestock, horses, dogs, and cats. Then they ate the rats, mice, and snakes scuttling within the fort. Finally, they turned to the unspeakable. One man was executed for murdering and eating his pregnant wife. Archaeological evidence, in the form of a 17-year-old girl's skull known as Jane, confirms what the journals described. Her bones are marked by the hesitant, desperate cuts of cannibalism. When the relief fleet finally arrived in the spring of 1610, they found only 60 skeletal survivors, crying out, "We are starved." It was a complete and utter failure, a graveyard, and it was only saved from abandonment by the fleet's arrival and the imposition of an even harsher, more militant law. Section 2. Brown Gold and the Powhatan War. The colony was saved from collapse, but it had no purpose. There was no gold. There was no passage to China. The investors in London were furious. Virginia was a failed state, a money pit. That all changed in 1612 thanks to a man named John Rolfe. Rolfe wasn't a soldier. He was a businessman who saw opportunity. The native tobacco was harsh, but he illegally procured a sweeter, more palatable strain from the Spanish Caribbean. He planted it in the rich alluvial soil of the James River, and it flourished. By 1617, Virginia was exporting 20,000 pounds of this brown gold to London. By 1629, it was 1.5 million pounds. This was the colony's salvation and its curse. Tobacco saved Virginia, but it is a famously ravenous crop. It exhausts the soil in a few seasons, creating an insatiable, relentless hunger for land. And that land was not empty. It belonged to Tsenacomaca, the paramount chiefdom of the Powhatan, ruled by the shrewd and powerful chief Wahunsunakok. The English had a complex relationship with him. He saw them as both a threat and a potential tool. Their powerful matchlock muskets were a potent weapon against his own rivals. This led to the famous and highly mythologized saving of John Smith by Wahunsunakok's young daughter Pocahontas, an event historians now see less as a romance and more as a political ritual, a symbolic adoption of Smith into the chiefdom. That fragile peace was formalized by John Rolfe's marriage to Pocahontas in 1614. But it could not last. Wahunsunakok died, and his brother Opechancanough took command. He had watched the English tobacco takers clear more and more land, pushing his people from their ancestral hunting grounds. He was not interested in diplomacy. On the morning of March 22, 1622, Opechancanough launched a devastating, coordinated surprise attack. Powhatan warriors, many of whom had been invited into English homes for breakfast, suddenly turned on their hosts. They killed with English tools, axes, and knives. In a few hours, 347 colonists were dead, a full quarter of the Virginia population. The Jamestown massacre fundamentally and permanently changed the English psyche. The Native American was no longer a potential convert or trading partner. He was, in their eyes, a savage, a treacherous non-human impediment to progress and profit. The English response was brutal and total. They adopted a feed-fight strategy, waging war not just on the Powhatan people, but on their food. They burned their cornfields in the summer, forcing them to starve in the winter. It was a slow, grinding war of annihilation that would define the southern colonies for a century. Section 3. The Puritan Experiment. 13 years after Jamestown's founding, another ship, smaller and battered, made its way to the New World. It was not funded by a corporation, and it was not crewed by soldiers of fortune. It was the Mayflower, and it was packed with families. These were the Pilgrims, a small group of separatists who had fled England for Holland and now for the wilderness. They had given up on the Church of England, believing it to be hopelessly corrupt. Their destination was Virginia, but storms blew them far north, to the hook of Cape Cod, in the dead of winter. It was November 1620. They were outside the bounds of any English charter. They had no legal right to be there. Before they even stepped ashore, they created their own government, the Mayflower Compact. It was a radical document, a civil body politic formed not by a king, but by the consent of the signatories. Like Jamestown, their first winter was a catastrophe. They were not prepared. They huddled on the ship while disease, scurvy, pneumonia, and consumption ripped through them. The living, their governor William Bradford would write, were scarce able to bury the dead. By spring, half of the 102 passengers were gone. They were saved by an alliance of desperation. The local Wampanoag tribe, led by the Sachem Massasoit, had been nearly wiped out by a plague, likely smallpox, just years earlier. They needed allies against their powerful rivals, the Narragansett. So they made a pragmatic peace, famously facilitated by Tisquantum, Squanto, a Wampanoag man who had been kidnapped by English traders and spoke fluent English. This alliance, born of mutual weakness, led to the famous Harvest Festival in 1621, the first Thanksgiving. But the Pilgrims were just the vanguard. In 1630, the real Great Migration began. A fleet of 11 ships carrying 1,000 Puritans arrived, founding the Massachusetts Bay Colony. These were not separatists, they were reformers. They didn't want to leave the Church of England, they wanted to purify it. And they would do it here, in the wilderness. Their leader, John Winthrop, gave a famous sermon, a model of Christian charity, declaring their mission. They were on an errand into the wilderness to build a city upon a hill. They would be a perfect, godly society, an example for all the world. The eyes of all people, Winthrop warned, are upon us. This was not just a colony. It was a theological experiment. And this pressure, the absolute need to be perfect in the eyes of God, created a society of intense communal scrutiny, deep faith, and a profound, terrifying fear of failure. Section 4. The Devil's Lair. In 17th century New England, there was no separation of church and state. The state was the church. The center of the village was not a tavern or a courthouse, it was the meeting house. Life was rigid, and it was public. Attendance at Sunday sermons, which could last 3 hours, was mandatory. The Puritans believed they were in a sacred covenant with God. If they obeyed his laws, they would prosper. If they sinned, they would be punished. And in this new land, God's punishments were everywhere. Winters were brutal, crops failed, children died from fevers. And worse, there was the forest. To the English settler, the American wilderness was not a place of beauty. It was a howling wilderness, the devil's lair, the physical manifestation of a fallen, godless world. They believed the forest was populated by savages, who, in their view, literally worshipped the devil. This fear was not an abstraction. It was real and immediate. In 1675, that fear was given a face. Metacomet, the son of Massasoit, the Wampanoag chief who had saved the Pilgrims, launched a war. Known to the English as King Philip, Metacomet had seen the future. He knew the endless English hunger for land would mean the end of his people. He united multiple tribes in a last, desperate attempt to drive the colonists into the sea. King Philip's War was the single bloodiest conflict in American history, per capita. It was terrifyingly intimate. Warriors attacked frontier towns, burning homes and dragging settlers from their beds. The English retaliated with equal brutality. The war confirmed the Puritans' darkest paranoia. The devil was in the woods, and he was using the Indians as his soldiers to destroy God's chosen people. The English won, but the trauma ran deep, and in 1692, that trauma found a new, internal enemy. The community of Salem Village was a pressure cooker. It was rife with petty jealousies, property disputes, and resentment against the more prosperous Salem town. On top of this, the colony's charter had been revoked, smallpox had returned, and the frontier was still smoldering from the war. The community felt punished by God. They were failing. And if they were failing, there must be sin in the camp. There must be a conspiracy. It started in the kitchen of the village minister, Samuel Parris. His 9-year-old daughter, Betty, and his 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams, began to have fits. They contorted, screamed, and complained of being pinched and bitten by invisible forces. The local doctor found no natural cause. His diagnosis: the evil hand is upon them. Pressed to name their tormentors, the girls pointed to 3 women on the absolute margins of society. Tituba, an enslaved woman in the Parris household, Sarah Good, a homeless beggar, and Sarah Osborne, an elderly non-church-going woman. They were the perfect scapegoats. When Tituba, likely under duress or torture, confessed to being a witch, she did more than save herself. She validated the community's darkest fears. She spoke of a black man in the woods, of a book she was forced to sign, and most terrifyingly of others. There was, she claimed, a coven of witches in Salem, working with the devil to bring down the colony. The panic began. A special court of oyer and terminer, to hear and determine, was established. The key evidence admitted was spectral evidence. the testimony of the afflicted girls that a witch's spectre or spirit was attacking them, invisible to all but the victim. This created an inescapable legal trap. If you were accused, you had two choices. You could confess to being a witch, repent, and name other witches, thereby saving your own life. Or you could maintain your innocence. But to maintain innocence was to directly contradict the spectral testimony of the afflicted. It was, in the court's eyes, proof of your arrogance and guilt. The panic fed on itself. The girls, suddenly the center of all power and attention, began accusing more and more people. The accusations moved from social outcasts to respected church-going members of the community. Bridget Bishop, a tavern owner, was the first to be hanged. Rebecca Nurse, a pious elderly matriarch, was initially found not guilty, but the court, pressured by the screams of the afflicted, forced the jury to reconsider. She was hanged. George Burroughs, a former minister, was accused. At the gallows, he recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly, something a witch was thought incapable of doing. The crowd wavered, but the girls shrieked that the devil was prompting him. He was hanged. The most horrific end came for Giles Corey, an 80-year-old farmer. Knowing he would be found guilty, he refused to enter a plea. The legal punishment was peine forte et dure, pressing. He was laid naked in a field, a board placed on his chest, and heavy stones were piled on, one by one, to force a plea. For 2 days he refused. His last words, "More weight." He was pressed to death. The fever finally broke in the autumn of 1692. The accusers, emboldened, flew too high. They accused the governor's own wife. Educated elites in Boston, led by Increase Mather, published works attacking the reliability of spectral evidence. Governor Phipps, his own wife now implicated, dissolved the special court. In just over a year, 19 men and women had been hanged. 1 man was pressed to death. Hundreds had been imprisoned. The city on a hill had not been attacked by the devil. It had consumed itself. The 17th century was not a story of buckled hats and peaceful Thanksgivings. It was a desperate, foundational, and often brutal struggle for survival, leaving a profound legacy of both individual resilience and violent intolerance. What part of this 17th century reality, the cannibalistic starvation in Jamestown or the psychological terror in Salem, do you find more shocking? If you found this unfiltered history as fascinating as we do, please share this video with a friend and subscribe for more hidden stories from America's founding.